One of the main uses in Blender for compositing is to split your 3D scene into layers and passes that you then reassemble later in compositing. This allows you to make adjustments to colors, reflections, or almost anything else without having to do a time-consuming re-render of your 3D scene. The way we start doing this is with view layers. View layers allow you to dictate what is rendered on each layer. You do this by assigning each view layer an associated set of collections. You can see in this guitar scene, I've already organized it into collections that make sense for this scene. The View Layers menu is right here above the outliner. It shows that we already have one view layer, which the scene requires. You cannot have less than one, but you can add as many other ones as you'd like. For this scene, we're going to create 5. Do that by clicking on the Add View Layer button and New until we have as many as we need. You can always add more later. The first one I'm going to call Guitar, and it'll be the main objects of this scene. The guitar and amp in the foreground and the instrument cables. The next view layer I'll call Other Objects, and it will obviously be the other objects in the scene, like the background amps and the stool, the water bottles, and the sheet music. The third view layer I'll call Backdrop, and it'll be the room, the curtains, and the carpet. The next layer will be called Volume Light, and it'll only be the volumetric light in the scene. And let's call that last layer Everything. Before we start assigning collections to the view layers, let's go into the filter menu and activate Holdout and Indirect Only. This will make the icons visible right in the outliner. So collections can be turned on or off, and they can also be off but still affect the scene, like casting shadows or creating a holdout, even if the object itself isn't visible. Turning these filters on will allow us quick access to those functions right in the outliner. You can also access the view layer options of each collection by right-clicking on the collection and going down to View Layer, but my preference is to have those buttons visible all the time. Let's start in the guitar view layer. We're going to turn off the parts of the scene we don't want to see on this layer, which is everything except the guitar, the main amplifier, and the instrument cables. Something to note, however, when we turned off the backdrop collection, it basically removed those objects from the scene, so we removed the shadows created between the foreground objects and the floor. We also lost the bounce light from the pink light that's shining on the walls and the curtain. You can see that here, the reduced shadows at the bottom of the guitar, and you can see how the pink bounce light is missing from the side of the amplifier. Activating the Indirect Only option while leaving a collection active will fix this. It will not render the objects in that collection, but it will render their influence on the remaining objects in the scene. However, we'll have to turn on Indirect Only for each of the nested collections individually, since that setting doesn't affect nested collections. We're going to leave the Lights collection on in every view layer, and we're going to turn off the Volume Cube collection in every view layer, except for the Volume Light collection. Let's jump into the Other Objects view layer, and turn off the guitar and main amplifier collections, but again, set the backdrop collection to Indirect Only. On the backdrop view layer, let's set all the other collections we don't need to Indirect Only. This will retain shadows and reflections, all that bounce light. Again, you can see that setting a collection to Indirect Only does not affect the nested collections. So we'll have to scroll those open and set every nested collection to Indirect as well. And in the Volume Light layer, we're going to set every collection to Holdout. We don't need any bounce lights or shadows from the objects, so the Holdout option allows us to basically stencil those objects out of the volume. The Everything view layer is something I sometimes use on complex scenes, so that I still have a layer I can work on where the entire scene is visible without disturbing this collection visibility setup we've just gone through. We won't be using this view layer in compositing, but it doesn't hurt to keep it around when working in the 3D view. I've got my render samples pretty low for the sake of this lesson because Blender will have to render each view layer separately, but let's kick off a render. Now in our render, we can see the different layers. Here's the guitar layer, the Other Objects layer, the backdrop layer, and the Volume Light. However, if we jump back to that guitar layer, we're supposed to have it rendered against a transparent background so we can composite it over the rest of the scene later on. Right now we're seeing the HDRI that's being used in the world environment for lighting. If we look at the alpha channel, you can see it's solid white, when it should actually be white only where objects on that render layer are, like the guitar and the amplifier. It should be black where it's transparent. This is a very easy fix. Just jump over to the Render tab. Down here under Film, check this transparent box. Now let's render again. Yeah, that looks better. And you can see that carried over to our other layers as well. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at render passes.